In Essential Task 9.9, we are going to discuss the major diagnostic category of neurodevelopmental and neurocognitive disorders. There are only two of them. We're very briefly going to talk about two disorders that you very well may have heard of: autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. As you just saw, the Essential Task, only one box. You could hold this horizontal, vertically, honestly, whatever way you prefer. But these are the last two disorders for our understanding. We'll start first by just describing neurodevelopmental disorder. So as a whole, this category talks about disorders that typically develop early on in life. So they're typically considered more childhood disorders. They're characterized, depending on the disorder, by deficits or deficiencies in, it can either be personal, social, academic, occupational functioning. That's a statement that can be applicable to all of the disorders. But what's key here is that these line up during early development. So generally speaking, you wouldn't see the manifestation of these symptoms at 45 years old. That would just be highly unlikely. You would see these symptoms manifest much earlier in life. There are going to be two for our purposes. The first one that you've assuredly heard of is autism spectrum disorder. I will note that the DSM-5, the most recent revision, recategorized disorders such as Asperger's syndrome and just autism disorder itself into this spectrum known as autism spectrum disorder. What that essentially means is individuals with autism spectrum disorder would be evaluated as needing some support or maybe very substantial support. So we could have things from minimal social communication to borderline full social communications. It can really vary depending on the individual. And now, as a result, we determine where along the autism spectrum each patient falls and then certainly provide whatever supports are necessary at that point. But autism spectrum disorder is a disorder that typically appears in childhood, and there are usually significant deficiencies in communication and social interactions. And then often that's coupled with what's called fixated interest or repetitive behaviors. So to kind of give you a sense of what we're talking about here, and you might have an individual who communicating socially might be a difficulty, but by and large, the individual does not require much more support. As a result, that person might be considered lower on the severity on the autism spectrum disorder spectrum. Individuals on the other side, though, might very rarely interact and have very few words within their communications and have such limited social communication that they require much more support, whether that's academically, occupationally, etc. Then on the other side of the spectrum, or rather the other side of the definition here, we have this fixated interest element. Individuals with autism spectrum disorder might take keen interests in some type of behavior, whether that's something artistic, whether that's chess, whether that's a card game, whether that's music, and have an individual who has a difficult time switching activities from that repetitive behavior. Oftentimes, or really in some cases, that might actually make it such that the patient has this exorbitant skill in one area. There are plenty of cases of individuals with autism spectrum disorder who are exceptional artists or musicians or graphic designers because that fixated interest in repetitive behavior has simply led them to practice a certain skill over and over and over again. So in some cases, that can certainly be harnessed for really incredible and awesome skill sets. However, it might make it such that in an academic environment, it's difficult to transition into a different area or into a different subject matter. So there's definitely that area to talk about, certainly. And the further up the spectrum you go, when it's a more severe case of autism spectrum disorder, there might be a lot of resistance to making changes. If, for example, you've already spent, let's say, 3-4 hours working on music for the day and say, well, you know what, we also need to work on math. That transition can be very difficult. So when we look at autism spectrum disorder, it's important to note that each individual patient gets evaluated in terms of where along the spectrum they might fall. In some cases, that might require very substantial support. In some cases, not quite as much. And incorporating two very key symptoms of deficiencies typically in social communications, but then also this fixated interests and repetitive behavior symptom. The last one that you've assuredly heard of is known as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD. This is another disorder that's a childhood disorder, so you're not really going to see this manifest at the age of 45. That would not be likely. But when we diagnose ADHD, we're looking for at least one of three key symptoms. We're looking for either extreme inattention, hyperactivity, or impulsiveness, though you theoretically could have 2 or 3 of those. One is necessary for the diagnosis. We could, though, theoretically look for all 3. The table here below, I think, does a really fantastic job of articulating some of the behaviors that you would look for to make this diagnosis. Again, you're not expected to copy this down, but I do want to run through a couple of the examples so that in the context of a case study or in the context of a multiple choice question, you could see potentially what we're looking for. So just go with inattention. I'm going to jump around a little bit here, but you might have a difficult time, paying attention in class or paying attention at work or paying attention at home. That would be a really clear example of inattention. You might have an individual who's easily distracted, whether that's at work or if we're talking about quite a bit younger or playing, an individual who makes careless mistakes or is disorganized, might seemingly forget something or forget where they left something or forget just doing the whole thing like homework, for example. Those would all be the types of behaviors that you would look for that would be consistent with inattention. Hyperactivity, as the name suggests, often has hyperactive in terms of movement. So we're talking about a difficulty sitting or the desire to always get up. From an academic perspective, if anybody someday becomes a teacher, you might potentially ask one of your students to do something like pass papers around the class. Let's say if you're working with children that are much younger, well, that's going to be a built-in opportunity for that student to get up out of their seat, which might be beneficial if you're looking at symptoms of hyperactivity. It doesn't necessarily have to be movement-based, though. It can be things like simply talking a lot or talking perhaps beyond what would be necessary in a work environment or a school environment. That would also be an example of hyperactivity, so it doesn't necessarily just have to be movement. The last one is impulsiveness, which might be, for example, talking without really processing or thinking about what it is that you're talking about, or maybe potentially talking out of turn. One of the interesting examples they list here is walking into the street without looking for traffic first, because there's that disconnect between, all right, let's process the degree to which there is danger here and let's just do it. There might not be that filter there to determine whether or not the actual decision to cross the street is safe. You might see an individual who answers a question before it's really completed. So those are some of the things that you would look for with impulsiveness. I will note, as is the case with a lot of the disorders that we've talked about, this one quite common. We have a variety of pharmaceutical approaches to treating ADHD symptoms, of which we'll talk more about in the second half of this unit. We're about to transition now into treatment, just to give you a little preview of that. So we'll talk eventually, particularly in the biological approach, about how disorders like ADHD are treated. And in addition to that, all of the other disorders.